There are moments in the wilderness that don't announce themselves. They simply arrive, quiet and urgent at once, and demand something from you before you've had time to decide whether you're ready to give it. It was late afternoon when he first heard it. The patrol had been moving through remote mountain terrain for most of the day, the kind of land that doesn't welcome visitors, where dry creek beds crack open the earth like old wounds and the tree line presses in from every side. Sergeant Daniel Mercer had done this route before. He knew the silences of this place. He knew the difference between the wind settling into the pines and something alive pushing through underbrush. So when the sound reached him, a frantic, strangled growling unlike anything he had catalogued in years of field work, he stopped walking before he'd consciously decided to. The other men stopped too. Nobody spoke. The sound came again, low, desperate, repeating, not the call of a predator announcing itself, but something closer to panic, something trapped. He moved toward it without waiting for confirmation. The creek bed curved west behind a cluster of boulders, and it was there, half hidden beneath a tangle of exposed roots, that he found the source. A young bobcat, barely past kittenhood, its spotted coat still carrying the soft markings of adolescence, had been caught in a wire snare. Illegal, deliberately set, the loop had closed around its front left leg, and every movement the animal made in its terror pulled the wire tighter. The leg was bleeding, the ground around it was torn from hours of struggling. The bobcat saw him and exploded into motion, thrashing, twisting, growling with everything it had. The snare held, the wounds deepened. Daniel knelt at a distance and went still. He had received no formal training for this. The protocol was clear. Do not approach injured wildlife, secure the perimeter, contact the appropriate wildlife authorities, and wait. It was the right protocol. It existed for good reasons. The nearest wildlife officer was, by his best estimate, somewhere between 2 and 3 hours away. He looked at the wire cutting into the animal's leg. He looked at the blood darkening the dry soil. He did the math quietly, the way soldiers learn to do, not with emotion, but with outcome. And the outcome told him the bobcat was not going to last 2 hours at this rate. Not the way it was fighting, not with that kind of blood loss. He made a decision. He pulled the heavy work gloves from his pack, the ones meant for clearing debris and handling sharp materials, and he asked one of his men for the emergency blanket they carried for field injuries. The other soldiers watched from a careful distance, uncertain. A couple of them shifted their weight the way men do when they want to object but can't find the exact words. He approached slowly. He kept his body low and his movements deliberate, the way you move when you want something frightened to understand that you are not a threat. Not charging, not retreating, just present. The bobcat screamed at him. It lunged as far as the snare would allow, teeth bared, eyes wide and burning. He didn't flinch. He had faced things that could actually kill him without flinching. He was not going to flinch at fear. It took time, more time than he expected. He spoke quietly as he worked, not words with meaning, just sound, something low and continuous, the way you might talk to yourself during a task that requires your full attention. Carefully, he draped the blanket over the animal to reduce its movement, using his body as a shield against its attempts to twist away. With both gloved hands, he found the snare mechanism, a crude, tight loop cinched around the leg, and he worked it loose millimeter by millimeter, keeping steady pressure without jerking, without rushing. When the wire finally released, the silence was immediate. The bobcat went still beneath the blanket. He held it for just a moment longer, then drew the blanket back slowly and stepped away. He gave it space, he gave it air, he gave it the chance to decide what happened next entirely on its own terms. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the blanket shifted. A spotted head emerged, golden eyes blinking against the late light. The bobcat looked directly at him, not with the blind panic of before, but with something harder to name, alert, measuring, present in a way it hadn't been while it was fighting for its life. He met its gaze and did not move. Then, without ceremony, the bobcat turned and walked into the forest, not running, not scrambling, walking, favoring the injured leg slightly, but moving with a quiet, deliberate dignity that struck him more than anything else about the afternoon. Within seconds, the trees had swallowed it completely, no sound, no trace, as if it had simply decided the encounter was finished and returned to the world it belonged to. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary. One of the men behind him exhaled. Nobody said much after that. They secured the illegal snare as evidence, noted the location in the patrol log, and resumed their route. He didn't expect to see the animal again. That wasn't a thought he carried with weight or sentiment. It was simply the nature of wild things. They survive, or they don't. They move on. You move on. The wilderness doesn't keep records of its kindnesses. That was 1 year ago. He is back on the same route now, moving through the same terrain with a different rotation of men, and the afternoon light is falling through the pines at the same low angle it was that day, when something at the edge of the tree line makes him slow his pace without quite knowing why. A pair of golden eyes, watching from the shadows, still. He didn't point it out immediately. He kept walking, kept his breathing even, and let his peripheral vision do the work. The eyes stayed with him, not stationary, moving but measured, tracking the patrol from just inside the tree line with a patience that didn't belong to something acting on hunger or aggression. He had spent enough time in wild terrain to know the difference between an animal that was hunting and an animal that was watching. This was watching. After another 100 yards, he said it quietly to the man beside him. "Don't react. Left tree line. We've got company." The word moved down the patrol in low murmurs. He felt the tension shift immediately. Shoulders tightening, hands adjusting, the collective awareness of trained men recalibrating to an unknown variable. 2 of the younger soldiers angled their heads toward the trees. One of them said it might be sick. Another said wild bobcats don't do this, don't shadow people, don't hold ground, don't stay visible when they could disappear in 3 strides. Both of them were right. Under normal circumstances they would have been completely right. But the animal wasn't behaving under normal circumstances. When the patrol slowed, it slowed. When they changed direction at the ridge fork, cutting north along the rock face, the bobcat adjusted without hesitation, moving parallel, maintaining the same distance, never closing the gap but never falling behind. It wasn't hurting them, it wasn't threatening them, it was simply present, accompanying them in the way that made no logical sense and yet felt, to him at least, completely deliberate. He found himself studying the animal more carefully now. The size was right. The coloring, tawny with faint darker rosettes across the shoulders, matched what he remembered, though memory across a year and a brief encounter wasn't something he trusted completely. There were bobcats throughout this range. It could be any of them. Then the animal stepped briefly into a patch of open light between 2 pines, and he saw it. A faint but unmistakable scar, a pale hairless line tracing the circumference of the front left leg, just above the paw, exactly where the snare wire had cut in. Exactly where he had worked the mechanism loose with both hands while the animal screamed at him. He stopped walking. The world around him continued, wind in the high branches, the quiet footfalls of his patrol, the ordinary sounds of the mountain, but he stood completely still, looking at that scar, and understood. This was her. She had survived. She had healed. She had come back to the same territory, the same creek drainage, the same patrol corridor, and she had found him in it. Before he could process what that meant, she broke her steady pace for the first time. She moved ahead of the patrol at a quiet trot, stopped 30 yards out, and turned to look directly back at him, waiting. He followed her. He knew how it would look. He knew what the protocol said about deviating from a planned patrol route, about following unpredictable wildlife into unfamiliar terrain, about the dozen small decisions that accumulate into a report somebody has to write later. He knew all of it, and he followed her anyway, signaling his men forward with a single hand gesture that said, "Trust me," more than it said anything tactical. She moved at a pace that felt intentional, not urgent, not fleeing. The kind of steady, purposeful movement that communicated direction without demand, as if she understood that the men behind her walked on 2 legs and needed more time than she did. When the terrain dipped and the footing became uncertain, she paused. When they caught up, she moved again. It went on like that for nearly 20 minutes, deeper into the forest, away from the patrol route and into country that felt older and quieter than the ridge they had left behind. The men behind him said nothing. He could feel their uncertainty, the weight of it, but nobody broke the silence. Something about the animal's behavior had shifted the atmosphere of the entire group. Even the skeptics had gone quiet. She stopped beside a rocky hillside, where a massive pine had fallen years ago, its root system torn from the earth and angled upward like a weathered wall. The space beneath the trunk where it met the ground had been hollowed by time and weather into something close to a chamber, sheltered, hidden, dry. He approached slowly, crouching as he neared the opening. Inside, 3 bobcat kittens blinked back at him. Small and spotted, their oversized paws tucked beneath them, their blue-gray eyes still carrying the cloudiness of early weeks. They were healthy, visibly, undeniably healthy. Round-bellied and curious, pressing together in the warmth of the den without fear, as if the large figure darkening their doorway was simply another part of the world arriving to look at them. He didn't move for a long moment. Behind him he heard one of his men exhale slowly, the sound a person makes when something lands in their chest before their mind has fully caught up. He turned to look at her. She stood 6 feet away, perfectly still, watching him with the kittens at his eye level. Her posture carried none of the tension of a mother defending. No flattened ears, no warning in the set of her shoulders. She had brought him here. She had made the choice, with full knowledge of what he was, to show him the most unguarded thing in her world. Then she took one quiet step toward him. She stopped just beyond arm's reach, not close enough to touch, not so far that the distance could be mistaken for caution. She had chosen exactly how near to stand, the way all wild things choose, precisely, deliberately, on their own terms. She looked at him with those gold-rimmed eyes, clear and steady, and he understood in that moment that this was not an accident of territory or instinct. She had sought him out. She had recognized him across a full year of wilderness and weather and the 1,000 unnamed things that fill an animal's life between one encounter and the next, and she had decided, with whatever wild intelligence she carried, that he was worth finding again. He didn't reach out. He didn't speak. He simply looked back at her the same way she was looking at him, openly, without agenda, letting the moment be exactly what it was. After several seconds she turned. The kittens had begun to stir at the entrance of the den, drawn by the presence of their mother and the strange quiet gathering of large figures just outside their world. She moved back toward them unhurriedly, settling into the space between her young with the ease of something that has never doubted its place. One kitten climbed across her forepaws, another pressed its face into her shoulder. The third sat upright and continued watching the soldier with enormous, unfrightened eyes. He stayed crouched at the den's edge for a moment longer. The arithmetic of it moved through him slowly, the way understanding sometimes arrives, not all at once, but in accumulating weight. A year ago he had knelt in a dry creek bed and made a decision that protocol didn't require, and nobody had asked of him. He had thought of it afterward, when he thought of it at all, as something small, a young animal freed, a snare dismantled. An afternoon that had cost him nothing but time, and left him with nothing but a quiet sense that it had been the right thing to do. He understood now what that afternoon had actually contained. These 3 kittens, alive, healthy, blinking in the filtered light of a mountain afternoon, had not existed yet when he cut that wire loose. They were the future of an animal he had chosen not to abandon. The full consequence of one unwitnessed act of compassion, made real in spotted fur and oversized paws, and the particular, unhurried peace of a mother who knew her family was safe. The patrol withdrew quietly, giving the den space, stepping back through the trees the way you leave something sacred, without rushing, without noise. At the edge of the tree line, he paused and looked back one final time. She was still watching him. Settled among her kittens, perfectly calm, her gaze following him the way it had followed him through the forest all afternoon, with a steadiness that asked nothing and offered everything. He held her gaze for one last moment. Then he turned and walked back into the world he belonged to, carrying something he would never quite find the words for, the particular, irreplaceable knowledge that compassion does not vanish when the moment ends. It moves forward, it takes root. It finds its way, through seasons and silence and the long patience of wild things, back to the hand that offered it. He never saw her again. He didn't need to.